today we have two illustrious guests that I will introduce in a moment. This is the Youth Employment Working Group of the Scaling Up Community of Practice. And for today's annual convening of the Community of Practice, we're going to be talking about employment opportunities created by the energy transition and scalable responses to help young people access those opportunities. Um, and I'd just like to sort of frame this with a couple things, is that when I think about the scale of the youth unemployment crisis, um, there's very few economic sectors or mega trends that I see as being able to, if not match it, be relevant in the face of that scale. But when I think of the energy transition, I think of one potential area of growth for youth employment that is at least on the scale of the problem. And when to put some numbers behind that, I know that we have 1.2, 1.8 billion young people today on Earth. And when I look at the International Energy Agency's projections for the number of green jobs created by 2030, it's in the tens of millions. And when I look at what that looks like this year in Brazil, that's 1 million new jobs just in the energy sector. But when I think about, are all of these young people going to be working in clean energy generation and transmission or making new uh, products such as electric vehicles? I wonder if there might be even more jobs. Um, and so what has inspired me greatly has been talking to industry leaders to talk about what does the energy transition look like in the day-to-day, and where might those hidden green jobs be that can take these large numbers and multiply them, um, so that we can start to think about not only where are these green jobs, but what are these green skills and how can we prepare young people for it. Um, and so with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. And if you could advance the slide, please, Gabby. Um, so we have two illustrious speakers. First, we have Armando Cortes, and he's a specialist in the automotive and auto parts industry with more than 15 years of experience in transnational public and private sectors. Today, he's the general manager at INA, which is the Auto Parts Industry Association in Mexico. Previously, he worked at Trade Export Canada. He served as ProMexico's executive director of the automotive and auto parts industry strategic projects manager, and then as a strategic projects manager at Chrysler Mexico, and finally as a consultant on international and foreign trade for automotive firms. He's the author of several publications on the sector in Mexico and a speaker at national and international events like this one. He's a promoter of the development of the automotive supply chains in Mexico. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics, a master's in strategic foresight from the Tecnológico de Monterrey, and a diploma in government innovation from the John F. Kennedy School of Government. So he'll be our second speaker today. Our first speaker is Casey Weston, and he helps lead LinkedIn's Data for Impact program, which shares aggregated data and insights with governments and leaders to inform public policy. And this aggregated data comes from the economic graph of LinkedIn, which if anybody is a nerd like I am, you'll find all these really cool reports about the state of skills and workers that are collected by LinkedIn's data from their members. He held data and policy roles in New York City Department of Health and the World Bank. And then I'm your moderator today. I'm also the co-chair of this working group, and I work at the International Youth Foundation, where I serve as their technical director for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I am an unabashed nerd looking at green skills, and I hope that everyone gets as excited as I am. So we're going to do today's conversation in two parts, and we invite your questions, comments, pushback, and discussion after each section. Our first section will be really looking at where are these green skills? What are these green skills? What are these green jobs? And we're going to hear from two very different perspectives. First, we're going to hear from Casey, where he's looking at data from LinkedIn members all over the globe. And we're going to be hearing from him about the important research and analysis that LinkedIn has done about the state of demand for green skills and green jobs. And then we're going to hear from Armando from a very different perspective in one country, in one sector that's immense. It's the automotive industry. But looking at where are these green jobs and what does this look like? Before we begin, you've just been introduced to Casey and Armando. Before Casey gets to start his fascinating conversation, I would like each of you guys who are in our audience to close your eyes, and I'd like you to imagine yourself in a green job. Once you have that in your mind, I would like it if you guys could either write a response to the survey that just came up of what is this green job? What does this look like? And if you can use an emoji, all the better. I don't know quite how we would use an emoji in our typing. If you want to also just enter it into the chat where there's an emoji option, it's the third one. Please do that to help us envision yourself in a green job. Let's give ourselves a couple more minutes, and then can you display the responses? So we've got a food systems, we've got happily assembling electric vehicles, we have agrivoltaic, we have a system designer, we have systems transformations, we have people working in agriculture, solar. What I hope we can do today, I tend to agree that this is fabulous. EV bikes, Asia, bikes in Africa, happily assembling. We've got someone that's just wearing sunglasses because they're in a green job. Maybe they work in a solar farm. Um, what I hope we can do today is speak to some of these key points that were just raised. We have systems transformation seems to be really highlighted and coming on top. And I think that when we think about the talent demand for our energy transition, what we're seeing is we're asking this generation of young people to transform industry from top to bottom with every purchase, every procedure, and every product. So I think that's a really critical insight. I think that when we think about what are green jobs, we hope to expand beyond some bikes, EVs, solar, and windmills, and think about some other hidden green jobs. So with that, I think we're going to move to Casey's presentation. And thank you for your patience, Casey, while we went through this fun activity.
No, not at all. Thank you so much, Liz, for inviting me today. I'm excited to be speaking alongside you and Armando, and thanks to everyone who's joining, really, and for your participation already in thinking creatively about what it means to have a green job and how we can all align employment goals with this really important global goal. So before I dive into some of the insights from LinkedIn's data, I just want to provide a little bit of context on why I'm here from LinkedIn and what I do. So as Liz kindly said, I help lead LinkedIn's Data for Impact program, which is the vehicle through which we share aggregated data and insights with public sector actors, multilaterals, governments, nonprofits, etc. And the reason that we do this is that LinkedIn's goal as a platform and as a company is to generate economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. That's a huge goal, and obviously we cannot accomplish that alone. It really requires that we collaborate with a wide variety of important actors to accomplish this. And so we've used our data, again, in a privacy preserving and aggregated way to amplify investments, to inform public policy decisions, and to enable research. So where does this data come from? Well, it comes from a wide variety of places on our platform, but mostly it comes from members choosing to provide their data to the platform and to the public. So over 1 billion members globally sharing data on the places that they work, the way that they've moved from one job to another, the skills that they've acquired in specific jobs and carried from one job to another, and their educational backgrounds as well. And so being able to cross all of this data, we can begin to extract some insights, not perfect by any means, but really informative and helpful in supplementing a public conversation around a wide variety of workforce development goals, everything from digital skill development and the way that AI might impact the workforce to gender equity, even at in levels of seniority within specific industries, and of course, thinking about the skills required for the green transition. So just to provide some concrete examples of what that looks like, we kind of work to really grow new ideas with partners. Sometimes we just provide data in response to a request, and in other situations, we integrate our data into ongoing labor market monitoring efforts by partner agencies. So with the OECD, we've supported work on understanding what it means to be a green entrepreneur and the rate at which green entrepreneurship is growing at the country level so that they can assess which policies are really facilitating green business development. We've worked with the IMF to support the development of investment strategies that would use green investments to help the economic recovery from COVID just after the pandemic, perhaps no longer ongoing. Having previously worked at the Department of Health, that's a contentious topic, so I'll skip right over it. And then we're working with the International Energy Agency to explore how we can support their ongoing efforts to ensure gender equity in the energy industry overall, but in particular segments of the energy industry as well. And so you can see this is an example of where our data is supplementing public data sets. So we would never want to replace them, but we hope that our data and insights can provide an additional layer of sort of vision into how the labor market is functioning. I'll get into the amazing collaboration that we've done with IYF in just a moment. So what does all this data tell us about green jobs, the green transition, the energy transition, et cetera? Well, there are three main takeaways that we have, and these can be found in our green skills work, which I'll paste a link to in the chat in just a moment. The first is that there are not enough people with green skills. So only 1 in 8 workers globally has even one green skill. Now you might be asking, how do we define green skills? Happy to dive into that methodology if it comes up in the questions, but the short version is that we have a taxonomy of 41,000 different skills. We've worked with experts as well as documentation to understand which tasks are required to reduce carbon use or mitigate its impacts. And then we've sort of aligned those tasks with the specific skills in our taxonomy, about 1,500 different skills that we then tagged as green skills, checking through with experts from some of the international partners that I mentioned before. We were then able to link those skills to specific jobs that we see often require those skills based off of the data from our platform. So all that said, we're seeing that there aren't enough people to drive, as Liz called it before, this really global and comprehensive transition that we need. This is highlighted by the fact that the demand for green skills, meaning when we look at job postings on our platform, the demand in those postings for these types of skills is growing twice as quickly as the share of workers on our platform with those green skills. And that gap is increasing over time. So we're seeing a huge gap in the number of people that have the skills and the skills diversity that's required to really fuel this transition. I think this is going to be a very wonky statistic, but it's an important one for our conversation. Most entrants, 80% of entrants into these green jobs, were already green talent, meaning they already had at least one green skill. Now, this might make sense. You know, if you would think if you're going into an accounting job, you probably already have an accounting skill, right? So no big surprise there. The problem is that we find that we will all need to become green talent. And so increasingly, people entering green jobs need to not have previously had a green skill, but be willing and able to acquire that green skill or those sets of green skills when they enter the job. So let me give sort of a more concrete example of what this might look like. Of course, we had your examples of green jobs before, everything from EV to solar and windmill and bikes, things that we think of traditionally as green, but we're finding that green skills are increasingly in demand in jobs that are not these traditional green jobs. So you see some examples here of a compliance manager, of a fleet manager, of a landscape architect, all of whom, to fuel the transition that we need in our energy systems, in our land use systems, in the accounting and finance systems that we use, need to have the skills to understand what green means, right? What carbon reduction means in their specific industry. The reason that I used a bank as my emoji in the response to Liz's question is that we find that actually finance is the area where green skills are falling behind the fastest. And if you're familiar with the huge windmill projects on the Northeast coast, close to where I am, I'm based in New York, you might know that actually one of the biggest challenges was not, I mean, there were huge challenges with logistics and regulatory and making sure that we had enough people with skills to build wind turbines out in the middle of the ocean, right? All of these were challenges, but some of the biggest issues were securing financing that included the right risk assessments given all of those complexities, because people didn't have the experience to structure financial deals that would actually accomplish this, right? And so when you're thinking about green jobs and green skills, we also need everybody in the pipeline to be familiar with green activities enough to support the transitions that are required. And so it's these types of jobs that we also need to be thinking about when we're thinking about green skills and green jobs. Just a couple other things I would be remiss not to flag are that there are inequalities across the skill development spectrum, of course, but particularly with regards to green skills. So there's a huge gender gap. We just did a large report on this gender gap that has implications, obviously, for equitable employment outcomes and income, et cetera, but also means that jobs where women already hold a larger share of the employment may be slower to include green skills. So in healthcare and the public sector, where at least in many wealthier countries, women play a larger role, what does this mean for the ability of green skills to enter if women are being held out for any number of reasons of traditional green jobs? We see that there are education, income, and age gaps as well, but there's one sort of silver lining in the age gap, which is that the share of green talent is growing faster among youth, right? So people who are entering the workforce now are acquiring green skills at a faster rate than people who have been in the workforce for longer. And that, I think, is concerning, because those of us who have been around for a while need to be brushing up on our green skills and all of our skills, perhaps. But it's exciting because it means that younger workers are positioning themselves to innovate even in entry-level roles. So even as an entry-level compliance officer or an entry-level fleet manager of a trucking company, right? These youth are beginning to acquire the green skills required to facilitate this transition. So just as a segue to Armando, who will be able to give really concrete examples given his industry expertise, I want to flag sort of how we worked with IYF to play one small role in the enormous work that they've been doing together with Armando and others to think about how we boost these green skills, particularly in the electric vehicle sector and particularly among youth. One thing that we can tell from our data bucket in electric vehicle skills, a small segment, of course, of the broader green skills group. And we were able to identify countries in which these skills were growing the fastest. And then we looked even just not nationally, but within the auto industry specifically to understand where these were. So no worries if you can't read this data here. That sort of wasn't the purpose, more just to show that this is the data that we pulled on to provide a little tiny bit of context to the amazing work that these wonderful partners were doing in helping to explore the growth of electric vehicle skills and think about how we can develop the workforce required to fuel this green transition. So with that, I will pause for perhaps any questions, but also just pass it on to Armando and Liz.
Thank you so much, Casey. Um, that's a great idea. We should probably ask if anyone has any burning questions from all of this data that Casey has presented. Please feel free to unmute yourself and just throw out a question if you like, or if you want to put it in the chat, that's fine as well. Or if you want to raise your hand. I'm going to give us 2 minutes to wait for questions if there are none. will move on, but it's not a speak now or forever hold your peace. Keep on developing your question and we can ask it a little later. Any questions? No.
Maybe
Okay.
one question that I'll ask people to reflect on as we transition to Armando is just thinking about the data that each of you might need in your roles, be it from LinkedIn or some other source, to help incorporate green skills into the work that you do, or to think about how your role can actually tie in as closely as possible to the transition we're all seeking to achieve.
That's an excellent piece of homework. So
I
let's all think about how we can leverage data and what type of data we might need. And then related to that, John Ingosh asked, are there ways for outside researchers to query the LinkedIn dataset referenced?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll paste some links below in the chat. We work with sort of a bound set of institutions to share data, ones that with whom we've developed agreements to ensure that privacy is protected. Even though we're sharing aggregated data sets, it's our number one priority to make sure that all of our members' privacy is protected, right? And so that restricts a little bit the number of partners that we can work with, but we also have reports from which data can be pulled. So I'll share those in the chat.
Oh, and there's another question for you from Luke Martin. I don't know if you can read that there, but I'll read it out loud. Most countries on the map were higher income countries. Is that due to LinkedIn data, or is it likely to reflect the actual workforces globally?
That's a great question. It's probably a little bit of both. The biggest constraint from my side is LinkedIn's data, because although we have 1 billion members, we certainly LinkedIn members are working in places that are more connected to the internet, more likely to be high income. Our members are more likely to be more educated. And so for those reasons, there are many lower income countries that are not reflected in our data. That said, there are quite a few, and that number is growing. Most of our growth at this point is outside of the US and Europe. So we're gathering more data as we go, but you'll have seen that India, certainly countries in Latin America were reflected on that list, but unfortunately, and this is a pain point for me literally daily, much of Africa outside of Egypt, South Africa, Morocco, Nigeria is missing from our data. So that's one place where we'd love to work with partners to think about how we can develop a richer understanding of the labor force transitions in those regions.
Thank you so much, Casey. I'm going to turn to Armando, and Armando is here to give us an overview of what these green jobs look like in the Mexican auto industry. We have the team from Tetra Tech who's backstopping this whole conference sharing Armando's slides, so he'll be calling out next slide. But again, I'd just like to say that we are so honored to have Armando here. He is one of the undisputed authorities on the Mexican auto industry. And I think that when I first started hearing about the green transition, the last place I imagined to see it was on the floor of a automotive factory. And I was completely wrong, both in terms of the products that they are making, and we're a very proud partner of INA in Mexico, where we're working with them around electric vehicle assembly. But what I've asked Armando here today to talk about are all the other jobs. If you're not making an electric vehicle, every day with your hands or with a robot, what are the other green jobs? So he's going to be sharing with us today about that. And with that, I'll let him take it away.
Thank you very much, Liz. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Buenos días a todos. It's a pleasure to be with you today just to share this knowledge and experience from the auto parts industry, particularly in Mexico. I want also to thank the Scaling Community of Practice to participate in this forum, Scaling Youth Employment in Response to Opportunities Created by the Energy Transition. And as you mentioned, Liz, the auto parts industry, it's a very global industry, and there are plenty of opportunities, particularly for cross-cutting green skills for young people. Next slide, please. And before starting, I would like just to give you a brief overview about INA, the Mexican Auto Parts Manufacturers Association. And INA was founded back in 1961, and we represent more than 700 manufacturing plants of auto parts in Mexico. So we represent many tier one companies, practically all of them worldwide in Mexican territory. And that is why it's very important just to know why it's important to talk about the auto parts industry when we talk about green skills or energy transition. And what we have learned so far is that collaboration is key for a successful energy transition. It's very important to have a collaboration between the public, the private, and the civil society sectors. And moreover, it's important to think civil society when working in a private company, and also to think about enforcement and compliance, even if we do not work in the public sector. So it's very relevant from energy transition and green skills. It's very important to have all these cross-cutting skills working, because we require all of them in order to have to advance the green agenda in the world. We need to remember that regardless, the climate change affects us all regardless of borders. So it's very important to learn what industries are doing regarding these jobs and what type of jobs we are talking about. Next slide, please. And I would like just to share this, why the relevance of cooperations, as I mentioned before, between Mexico and the United States in environmental policies. And well, I think Mexico's experience is relevant for two things. First, Mexico is the biggest exporter to the US for the first time in 20 years. The latest figures from the US Department of Commerce shows that it overtook China in 2023. So we have a very close economic relationship between Mexico and the US, and that is why it's very important to collaborate in developing all these curricula and all these green skills required in the industry in these two countries. And on the other hand, as you can see here in the maps, the distance, the border between Mexico and the US is about 1,960 miles. And this distance is the same from Madrid to St. Petersburg in Europe. So you can cross the whole Europe, and it is the same distance of the border between Mexico and the US. So, and sometimes Mexico is like the unknown, a distant neighbor. So sometimes we do not know very well each other between Mexico and the US, but at the end, all the impact, the climate change, it's very important just to address it in a very collaborative way, just to have better results as we share geographically. We have a very close geographical relationship. Next one, please. And just to give you, of course, Casey just showed you very interesting figures about what is the market regarding green skills. But I would like you just to give you an overview of the automotive industry in Mexico to have a better understanding of what type of particular green jobs or green skills are required right now. And in the industry in Mexico, the average age is 36 years old. So we are talking about millennials. And it's very important that we should know that we need to address this millennial perspective of life and perspective of this climate and environment protection, because millennials are very concerned about these issues. So I think we are in a good time just to address these green cross-cutting green skills. And 37% are women and 63% are men. So we have a gender gap here in the industry in general. The average schooling is 14 years. In Mexico, this industry creates 1 million direct jobs, and 9 out of 10 of these jobs are blue-collar workers. So it's very important to have in mind that we need to address these blue-collar workers if we want to change things regarding environment. And the industry is very relevant itself in Mexico. It represents 4% of the total gross domestic product and 20% of the manufacturing GDP of Mexico. And when we talk about energy transition and technology or electric vehicles, it's also important to know that in Mexico, for instance, only 1% of all vehicles sold in the country are electric. And this trend probably is something similar in the US. The goals for EV vehicles in the US are basically for 2030. But right now, the market of electric vehicles in the US and worldwide is slowing down. So probably we will see that this goal of 2030 is going to be a goal of 2040. And anyway, we need to continue working on these skills just to strengthen this transition to more environmental friendly vehicles. And another thing very important to consider regarding this industry is that 43% of all auto parts imported by the United States comes from Mexico. So we are very close when talking about the automotive industry between Mexico and the US. Practically half of all auto parts required by the automotive industry in the United States comes from Mexico. That is why it's very relevant just to adjust our view to secure that in the supply chain of the vehicles of the automotive industry, we comply with the highest standards when talking about green skills. Next slide, please. And what it's about, we need to talk about human capital transformation or reskilling and upskilling. And from an industry perspective, it's very important to talk about sustainability, of course, digitalization, security, and energy efficiency. And when talking about energy transition and green skills, I would like to address two particular issues: sustainability and energy efficiency. We have in the automotive industry, the energy efficiency is critical in the industrial process. Regardless of it is an internal combustion engine or an electric vehicle, the whole industrial process requires to be very, very energy efficient. And that is why in the auto parts industry, the way we take care of water and waste in the manufacturing plants complies with the highest standards worldwide. In Mexico, we have probably, from a technological standpoint, the most important plants in the auto parts industry, more important probably than some of the plants in the US or Germany or Japan, because the newest plants, auto parts plant in the world, many of them are in Mexico. So we have state-of-the-art technology, and that is why it's very important to have these high standards regarding green skills. And another thing is important. I think we do not need to think about compartments to think that you need to be specialized only in green skills. I think that's very important to emphasize that green skills are cross-cutting skills. So I think we should all know about how to be related to green skills. It's not something that it's only to have a major or something like that regarding green skills, but all we are committed to protect environment and to fight against climate change. And when we talk, for instance, new skills required in the automotive industry, auto parts, you know, embedded software, cybersecurity, algorithm, edge computing, cloud computing, data analysis, as Casey showed us a little bit ago, and artificial intelligence. All of these are, for sure, new skills that are very, very demanded right now in the auto industry. But I would like to focus on the last four, because what we are seeing in the auto parts industry is that we need to have more interest in energy management, particularly renewable energies. And in this regard, it's good to know that all OEMs, original equipment manufacturers worldwide, requires the supply chain to comply with very high standards regarding energy efficiency and environmental protection. So it's not any longer that it's only an individual responsibility. It's a collective responsibility. And many of the times, this collective responsibility involves different countries. Just to give you an example, back in 2023, January 1st, Germany just published something called the Supply Chains Act. And this Supply Chains Act in Germany requires all the supply chain of the automotive industry to comply with the highest standards for environmental protection, regardless of the country they are located. And of course, there is a challenge in terms of enforcement, but right now, all the supply chain of the automotive industry located in Mexico is complying with those high standards because it is required by the buyers. So if we can work closely together as a supply chain to secure the energy transition, we are going to be much more successful. The second thing is renewable energy, as I mentioned before. About 30% of all energy in the auto parts industry requires to be green energy. So that is why it's very important just to offer curricula or academic programs related to these skills. And of course, we have the traditional roles or profiles for the auto parts industry related with environment, health, and safety that is mainly related to comply with the policies, local policies regarding environment. But anyway, in Mexico, we comply both with local laws and local regulations regarding environment, but also with international standards to comply with the OEMs or automotive industries in other parts of the world. And of course, waste management. That's one of the things that we need to focus on. And finally, next slide, please, just to conclude this part of the presentation. What are right now the main business opportunities in the electromobility value chain? As I mentioned before, we have all heard about this transition to electric vehicles. Unfortunately, the market worldwide is slowing down a little bit because there are certain challenges regarding infrastructure stations and things like that. But anyway, if we see the electromobility pyramid, what are the challenges for young people to study or to work on in order to define these new green skills in the auto industry? And of course, we have at the top of the pyramid the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers. We are talking about all American manufacturers, General Motors, Ford, European, BMW, Mercedes, Daimler, of course, etc. The tier one are the ones that sell components to the OEMs. The tier two are the ones who sell components to the tier one. And the tier three are the ones who sell components to the tier two. So if we take into consideration this pyramid, these are the things we need to focus on. On the base of the pyramid, of course, we have the raw materials like lithium, graphene, aluminum, and steel, and we need to address this from an environmental perspective. So we need to know that this is not only about talking about electric vehicles, but from well to wheel. It doesn't have any sense if we use some kind of energy, non-green energy, to provide charge to our electric vehicles. So if we use coal energy to supply our electric vehicles, it doesn't make any sense. So we need to have particularly programs in order for renewable energy to produce in an efficient way, and then how are we going to manage waste, battery waste, for instance. So at the base of the pyramid, we have raw materials, then tier two, assembly of batteries, casing, and waste management, as I mentioned before. Of course, if we go to a higher level of technology, sensors and radars, ADAS, advanced driving assistance systems, cable and harnesses, powertrain components, braking systems, etc. And at the top, charging infrastructure and after-sales services. So I think we need to focus on this. Right now in Mexico, we are working closely together with the International Youth Foundation to develop all these new skills required by the market. And it's very important to know that we need to work all closely together, because we need to bring into the industry the view of the civil society, the view of the academy, and we need to understand that we need to work closely together with the government as well. So we need, and this is a teamwork, we are right now designing a curricula in Mexico together with the International Youth Foundation to address these green skills required by the industry. And we think we are going to have a very positive impact because of the relevance of this industry in Mexico. That will be all from my side, and of course, I would be gladly responding all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Armando, for that incredible overview. First of the automotive industry in Mexico, and then what the green skills look like. I'd like to open up the floor to questions. If you would like to put them in the chat or open your microphone. I have a question for Armando in the interim. My first question is, could you please speak a little bit more around the business incentives that are driving those bottom 4 skills that you mentioned, where you had waste management, energy efficiency. I forget the other 2. But could you talked a little
Yes.
bit about legislation in Europe that was impacting skills that were demanded in Mexico, and that sort of blew my mind. So could you talk a little bit about the incentives that are driving the demand for these skills?
For sure, Liz. And the wonderful thing about this is that in Mexico, all these regulations are not enforced by the Mexican government. We follow these regulations because we are part of an international supply chain. And this is part of the thing that I mentioned before. This is all about cooperation, regardless of having or not a policy in a particular country. So from a business perspective, we need to comply with the standards set by our buyer. In this case, the company located in Japan, Germany, the US. Most of the companies in the auto parts industry are American companies, most of them, in terms of investment. So in this regard, we comply with the highest standards of the US in terms of waste management, energy efficiency, etc. So that is why, from a business perspective, is of the essence to comply with these environmental policies inside the factories, inside the facilities, not only because we have a regulation in Mexico, but primarily because our clients requires us to have it. And this is something that we are just trying, just how can we translate or how we put all this regulation in our communities as well. So because we know right now that inside the facilities, inside factories, we are complying with the highest standards inside them. But what happens once we just get out the facilities to our communities or to our houses? So that's the challenge. And what we have seen is that there are a lot of experiences happening right now in Mexico, that some of these regulations regarding green skills are just going to other industries because it's part of the culture that is growing in Mexico. And as I mentioned before, millennials are very concerned about this issue. So it's for us, it's very important just to provide support to this generation that is taking very seriously the climate change challenges, and for the young people, that is studying right now.
Thank you so much. I have that was super useful. I have so many follow-up questions, but I want to make sure that everyone else gets to ask their questions. Before I read the next question in the chat, I wanted to highlight that if you do have a question, please use the raise your hand feature, which you'll find at the top of Teams, so that we can find you in the group of participants and call on you. In the interim, Johannes Lin asked a 4-part question. So I'm going to break it into parts. But the first I would like to ask, I think, is a really interesting point, and I'd like to ask it to Casey around the earnings potentials of these green skills and the incentives that young people might face when they're considering should they be requiring these skills needed by industry.
Yeah, that's a great question indeed. I love all the parts of this question, Johannes. So a couple of things that we're seeing on the platform. First, what we call the LinkedIn hiring rate, which is essentially a measure of labor market churn or labor market activity and demand, is higher for green jobs than the labor market overall, which means that these green skills are in high demand, so much so that it's allowing people with these skills to transfer through roles more quickly. And usually you transfer through a role either because it's giving you some great satisfaction or because you're making more money. So that's a signal to us that there is high earning potential tied to green skills overall. what I would say is that the specificity of the green skill varies in many cases by industry. And so understanding how to specialize one's skills within the industry context will be increasingly useful. And this is particularly true for people who already have a certain industrial experience and may want to retain the value of the skills that they've acquired through that experience, but make sure that they are well positioned for the green elements of that industry. So an example here is someone who already has experience in the automotive industry or the finance industry or utilities. Rather than going out and seeking a green job in an entirely different industry, what you would want to think about is how you can add a green lens or a green sort of side to your skill set that would allow you to step into the increasing number of roles across industries that require those types of skills. And so I like almost hate that I keep repeating the phrase green skills because it's so vague and abstract, although behind that, there's a methodology and a long list of actual skills. So it's not entirely abstract, but that's because it requires industry specification. So yes, we have signals that there is earning potential. The other piece here, I think around incentives is the need to change the way that we talk about skill acquisition. So, and this speaks a little bit to the first part of your question, but we have seen that the changes in required skill sets for each job change fairly quickly, and that rate of change is increasing. So that's caused by the need to acquire green skills very rapidly across industries. It's also caused by some of the other skill areas that Armando called out, particularly AI, right? But we see skill changes all the time. However long ago, when the pandemic started, none of us knew how to use Teams, or a few of us were on Zoom and WebEx and whatever else. And all of a sudden now we think we know at least how to troubleshoot half of the things in these programs. We had to acquire that skill very suddenly for a specific reason, but that's not unlike the other changes that cause us to acquire skills rather rapidly. And so what that means is that it's not just youth being incentivized to, as Armando was saying before, major in a specific thing in school or study a specific topic, but to constantly be thinking about the way in which they are adapting their skills to the very quickly changing needs of the workforce. And in this case, that means green skills, but it also means AI, literacy, et cetera. And so weaving that into our understanding of skill development will be critical for achieving the change that we want at scale.
Thank you so much, Casey. Armando, do you have anything to add?
Yes, two points, Johannes. I think, first of all, in Mexico, for instance, we follow a German education system called dual system that consists in having practical lessons inside a facility and having theoretical lessons in the academy. And this is very useful because you have the view of two different worlds. You have the view of the industry and you have the view of the academy that sometimes are not very aligned. In this regards, is very important on the one side. And on the other hand, it's, I think, from a business perspective, recycling is going to be a very appealing industry in the future. And why is this? For instance, all the world is talking about electric vehicles, but no one is talking about how we are going to recycle batteries. So this is something that we are going to require for sure. And this is a challenge, a huge challenge, because in general terms, batteries are very pollutant when you want to recycle. But this is something new, and probably we should be thinking that when you buy a vehicle, you do not think how are going to recycle your vehicle 30 years from now. That's the last thing you think, and you should, because that's part of your responsibility. If you are buying a car, you should be thinking how are you going to impact the environment 30 years from now because you are buying it. But that's not the way things happen, because if you sell the car 4 years from now, it's like you transfer the responsibility to other guy, and that's it. And you say, well, I don't know how we're going to recycle. So this requires commitment, but there are going to be plenty of new businesses regarding waste management and recycling because of this circular economy we are all in. That would be my 2 comments.
Thank you so much. I would love to ask I'm actually going to send a fantastic podcast link about specifically Mind the EV Battery Recycling Gap, which I thought was amazing. It's by one of my favorite podcasts, which is the Bloomberg NEF Switched On podcast. Highly recommend it if you're interested in the energy transition. Um, with that in mind, I wanted to ask Casey and Armando if you would be willing to go a little bit deeper into what you see as effective approaches to upskilling or developing new green skills and what these green skills might look like. And with that, I know, Casey, you'd prepared some slides on what are these green skills, what do they look like, where are they? And sort of any approaches that LinkedIn has taken to develop these skills would be of great interest. And then Armando, if you would be willing to do the same after Casey. Please take it away, Casey. We're going to speak for about 5-10 minutes each, and then open it up for a final round of questions.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I'm happy to dive into a little bit of the methodology that, and I'll try not to go too deeply because it can get very wonky very quickly. Let me see, there we go. So essentially, I'm going to walk through pretty quickly our methodology and get to the implications for us and for upskilling. So the way that we identify the skills that are required for a specific role is not by understanding the roles or the skills that are most frequent across the workforce for a given occupation. And the reason that we don't do that is, as you can see here, that would always yield things like Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Office, Word, PowerPoint. We often see teamwork, problem solving, all great skills. But if the same list of skills comes up for a data analyst and a nurse, then we start to wonder what's the use of looking at that list, right? So instead, we look at the skills that are disproportionately frequent for any given occupation. And that really allows us to identify those skills that stand out and make an occupation unique, that we see being deployed in a really critical way for folks in that specific occupation. And so to get from this to a list of green skills, as I mentioned before, we worked with ONED and the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, to understand what activities they had labeled as contributing to carbon emission reduction or mitigation of the impacts of carbon emission. We then took those tasks and linked it to specific skills. We started with a large list of about 2,800 and then began to whittle down from there. We were able to then kind of understand the extent to which they were really critical for green activities or adjacent. So you might think of studying certain things that are, adjacent to green activities. Zoology is a great example that I see popping out here, but that doesn't necessarily immediately position you to hold a job that's facilitating either carbon reduction or mitigation. So through this refinement process, we were able to sort of land at a list of skills that we could then tie to jobs. Excuse the smaller font here. We then were able to bucket those jobs based off of the extent to which they leveraged those very skills, right? And so that's sort of what led us into this list of skills. Now, well, I'll pause here to just reiterate again the gap that we're seeing, and this is accelerated past 2021, which is the last date here, but I think I reflected it in the first part of the presentation, sort of like the rate of job postings that require green skills is growing twice as fast as the number of people who have them. And so if we're thinking about how to upskill and sort of integrate green skills into the skill sets of the broader workforce, I think there's sort of three main elements of that I would approach. The first is through formal education systems, but those formal education systems need to have a very quick feedback loop between employment and curriculum development. And that's something that IYF has done incredibly in working with us and doing a huge amount of work on their own and in collaboration with Armando and others to ensure that these industry education ties are as tight as possible. Because, as we said before, the skills required for jobs are changing so quickly, you really need to tie this in closely. An example of this, this is a very different conversation, but related. I was speaking to a high school teacher who represented a large number of teachers that was saying maybe we should be moving from teaching the Pythagorean theorem in schools to teaching Python because that's the skill that's really necessary. And my response was, well, given AI's ability to do coding, you might want to skip Python altogether and think about teaching the next thing that we'll need to use AI to do Python coding, right? And so they're changing so fast that it's really skilled needs are changing so fast that it's really critical to have this link. The second piece in thinking about the upskilling process here would be informal education. So I distinguish this a little bit from on-the-job education in that it's people's ability to dive into content on their own by understanding what's critical. So this requires the engagement of amazing industry actors like Armando in facilitating a public conversation around where skill needs are and what's coming down the pike. So for any of you working in skilling and green areas might have taken note of this flag about battery recycling, right? That's something that needs to be incorporated and studied even loosely so that people understand that there will be jobs in that area. And this is something that LinkedIn's Economic Graph team attempts to do as well by creating conversations around jobs that we see to be emergent or skills that we see to be emergent so that people broadly have awareness of what's needed. And then the third bucket of this process is really on the job skill acquisition. This is something that ties in with an emphasis of ours at LinkedIn, but is an emphasis of many governments as well, which is skills-based hiring. So as people are acquiring skills on the job, we would hope that that skill acquisition is honored and reflected in the hiring processes of businesses that are seeking those skills. If we're just looking at, for example, titles that people have acquired or the previous experience or the role that they had, we may be missing out on the actual critical skills that are underlying that. So, we can use my example of compliance manager. I'm sure Armando would have even more examples from the automotive industry. But if someone has the role compliance manager and I say, oh, great, they're going to fit well into the compliance manager role that I'm hiring for, we may miss the fact that they actually don't have any experience in thinking about green regulation, or they don't have any experience thinking about some of the constraints around windmill farm creation in the Northeast Corridor, right? So by really looking at the skills that someone has, we're able to better assess whether or not they will be able to execute the responsibilities of a role effectively. And that requires that we track skills very well during the on-the-job acquisition process. Something that LinkedIn can facilitate, but that we can all facilitate by paying attention to that and encouraging hiring systems that prioritize an understanding of skills alongside understanding formal education, previous work titles, etc. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Liz and Armando.
Okay, wonderful presentation, Casey. I think we as an industry, we agree with all what Casey said. I only just would like to say that two things. Right now, traditional automotive industry focus like in positions like compliance manager, environmental health and safe positions, and supplier development, for instance. So all of them are going to change. So this is going to be like upskilling, because the compliance manager is no longer just need to see local regulations, but international regulations. So we need to just transition from just looking at domestic policies, and we need to start looking at international policies because we are all involved in the same supply chain. The same thing with environment, health, and safety positions. Right now, electric vehicles bring a lot of challenges. How are you going to manage batteries? And there are plenty of things you need to know on this regard. And of course, there are, as Casey mentioned, a lot of technology, Python and programming and things like that related to new technologies. But all these things are going to work closely together for new profiles, for new job profiles. And in terms of supplier development positions, and I think the green transition is allowing to go from a very individual perspective to a community perspective. So we used to have positions very focused on the company. Like we are going just to take care about our business and our close community. And right now we are transitioning to look more like what is going to be the impact on other companies. We need to take care about the whole supply chain, regardless of it is in the same country or in other, because there are certain regulations that are taking place as a part of a global supply chain. So I think what we are looking is that we are starting thinking more like a community, a global community. And in this regard, we need to comply not only with local regulation, but with international standards. And this is going to require a completely different profile. You need to think more as a team and less than an individual. And I think this is going to be a very relevant approach. And these are the things that we are working in Mexico together with the civil society and the public sector. So it's very important to cooperate and to have this profile. On the one hand, new technology trends, and on the other, to start thinking more like a community. I think that would be in general terms, my comment on this.
Thank you so much, both. I wanted to open it up for one final round of questions, and I would like to kick it off, if that's okay. My question is, there were a list in your list of skills that you had, Armando, where you had the young woman and young man in the automotive industry and then a bunch of bullets. There were a lot related to the sort of digital disruption in industry writ large. And I know that the energy transition and the continuing advancing of Industry 4.0 and the entry of AI into advanced manufacturing are all happening at once. It's like that movie, you know, everything everywhere all at once. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about this overlap of the critical skills required to achieve energy efficiency, effective waste management, and the entry of automation into manufacturing processes. If you could sort of help us understand what that looks like, because then I have a follow-up questions I'd like to ask about what does that mean in terms of skills development?
Yes, again, I think, well, it's a very complex question, but I'm going to try to answer it. In general terms, digitalization or automation, it has been all the last 20 years we have lived with automation and digitalization and automation. It's part of the trends. You always go to new technologies, and right now, as I mentioned before, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, edge computing, and things like this. You always think about it as individual technologies, but the fact is that all these technologies are related to other things. Let's put an example: Bitcoins. You never know about the energy required to deal with Bitcoins. You only think about Bitcoins, but the fact is that in order to deal with Bitcoins, you require tons of energy to deal with that, and nobody is wondering if that energy is renewable or not, and we need to start thinking about this. It's the same with electric vehicles. If you have an electric vehicle, you need to secure that you are having a green energy source, because otherwise you are going to have an electric vehicle and you are not going to be contributing to environment protection. So you need to think holistically. I think that would be my first approach. And it is the same with technology. Technology and green skills are very related, because technology allows us just to make a lot of processes without prototyping. And prototyping requires to use materials, and that increases waste. And digitalization allows us just to work a lot in a computer without using a single source of material. So that is some of the things we see in the auto industry. Right now, for instance, you can go directly from a digital model to production directly. So you do not require all previous steps like 10 years ago. You need to prototype, you need to test. So digitalization and automation are allowing just to save resources. And in that way, we are greener than any time before. So I would say that. And that is why it's very important to have these cross-cutting skills, because you need to be more concerned about the origin of the energy you use. You need to more concerned about the tools you use in your work in order to contribute to this higher goal that is fighting climate change. And I think we live in a good time. Of course, sometimes we think that job profiles answers uniquely to business and to return, but that's not the case anymore. I think that we are more conscious people right now, and that technology is allowing us to think more holistically and to be more responsible with the use of resources in general.
Thank you, Armando. So I'm really hearing a strong demand for systemic and critical thinking among workers at all levels. With that, I saw that Nancy McPherson raised her hand. I'd ask her to take herself off mute, and then we have some questions in the chat we'll get to next. Please, Nancy.
Thanks very much, and thanks Armando and Casey. Really good illustration of opportunity. My question may actually be the same as Inga's, in that there's a lot of research now that shows that unless we intentionally provide opportunities to address inequalities in relation to gender, marginalized populations, that these populations are not going to be able to access these opportunities. Can you talk about how you are purposely, intentionally addressing this so that these great, exciting opportunities don't leave some populations even further behind than they already are? Thank you.
I'd like to send that to Casey first, because you had an excellent slide about the gender differential in green squirrel acquisition.
Yeah, so I will not. That's a really important and critical question. I'm so glad that you asked it. I think there's so many different lenses of inequality that we could be thinking about. Certainly gender is one that we've considered, particularly with regards to green skills and green jobs, for the reason that I mentioned before, that obviously it's like problematic from an equitable employment outcomes perspective, but we also believe that it will slow down our ability to respond to the enormity of the challenge required by the green transition. And so we have some recommendations in a report that I'll put in a chat in a second about how employers and regulators can think about addressing the gender gap in green jobs and within the industries that we find green jobs are most prevalent. Certainly the skills-based hiring element that I mentioned before speaks a little bit to this. If we are using a skills lens as opposed to a title lens when we're doing hiring, that is one way in which we can be more imaginative about individuals' ability to cross industries or cross occupations, carrying their skills with them in an important way, right? So broadly speaking, I think being more open to the application of skills in new contexts is one way that we can encourage employers, for example, to address some of these gaps. Just speaking a little bit as well to the inequality in terms of regionality, certainly. Yeah, and then there's one more point about AI, I think. So in terms of regionality, and this is something that's alluded to in the question in the chat, so maybe I'll just read it briefly. Are there any recommendations or insights you can share when it comes to the informal green economy reality in many parts of the world, and the benefits of engaging in non-formal education, providing access to vulnerable youth, and trying to leave no one behind? So here, I think understanding the enabling factors for industry to thrive is probably where we need to start. That's not a really fun place, but I think Armando would tell you that we can't employ people if we don't have the ability to set up a functioning industry. Well, those jobs will remain informal and therefore more susceptible to any variety of problems, lower wages overall, much more instability, and so we're still bifurcating or splitting up the labor market in a way that's inequitable. One opportunity here is to think about how, particularly in emerging markets, industries can leverage the nascency of the enabling environment to shape it to be green from the beginning. And this ties into this idea of working with youth who will have this ability to be more entrepreneurial, to apply more innovative skills from the get-go, so that we're not actually thinking about changing systems, but we're building them the best way that we know how currently the first time, right? And so this is a little bit different than just like a leapfrogging idea, but really thinking about how we can incorporate the innovative side of green skills in industrial development that brings everybody along with it. The third piece I wanted to flag is with regards to the impacts of AI. So we've also explored how generative AI may impact youth specifically, but may have unequal impacts across the labor market. And I think this ties into, as we talked about before, to the discussion around green skills. I'll paste a link to that analysis in the chat, but not surprisingly, we found that labor market impacts may be more disruptive for women, more disruptive for young workers, more disruptive for workers in particular industries. And so understanding how we can go back to the critical thinking skills that allow workers to navigate these changes more effectively, I think will be critical for all of us. So even as we think about very content-specific training modules or even on-the-job training opportunities, making sure that we are weaving in this critical thinking that allows workers to be flexible will ensure their access to success moving forward.
Thank you so much, Casey. Armando, adelante.
Thank you very much, Liz. Well, I think, and I didn't mention this before, but what we are doing in Mexico right now, it's mainly focused on marginalized populations. In general terms, this project we are developing with the International Youth Foundation is focused on public education only. And with this medium upper level, technical level, I don't know if it's the same level in the US, but it's mainly for young people that attends public schooling in Mexico. And this is because we want to increase the development of certain regions in Mexico. Right now, we have a lot of demand in the automotive industry in Mexico. We have plenty of job openings in facilities, and we require just to design programs for young people in order to supply all this demand that is currently underserved in Mexico. And we have seen that this is a private company effort. And sometimes it's funny, because you may think that the government should be addressing all these challenges, but in our experience, you can wait for centuries if you only rely on the government policies. So you need commitment from private companies. And of course, this is something completely new, but it's something that we are currently doing in Mexico. How can we use private resources to promote public education? And this is of the essence, because if you do not do that, you are not going to have the talent and the labor required for your company. So you need to work on this from a private standpoint, even if it's a public effort. I don't know. That is why it's very important just to start thinking a little bit different in this regard. And something similar, we have seen this not only in Mexico. For instance, in the south of the US, we have seen that several auto parts plants, they are struggling to get enough people to work in the manufacturing industries. And this is that is why this is not only a Mexican challenge, but a US challenge and probably a world challenge. How you can train the talent and young people to do this. And in Mexico, we have another challenge as well, because young people, sometimes I heard young people to say, no, I'm going to become an Uber driver and I'm going to earn more money. But the problem with that thought is that you are building a narrative that is not going to be strong in the future. If you enter to an industry, in this case, the automotive industry, you have a powerful narrative about your life and your professional life. You are going to be involved with technology, with producing something, with impacting your community in a very holistic way. And that's not going to give you as a Uber driver. So you need to think, and these things are not only about money. At the end, and this is very important to know, we need to grow this option that you need to enter to a formal job with the right training in order to build your future life. And this is something that we are trying to work with young people, having conferences and working with communities very close together. So I would say that in the case of Mexico, the auto industry is one of the better industries or the best industries to promote community development in general terms.
Thank you so much, both. We have 5 more minutes, so I would like to invite and encourage anyone who has a further question. I saw that, thank you, Casey, for posing Inga's question and responding to it. And I wanted to ask if anyone else has a question. We have 5 more minutes on our panel to please open their microphone, raise their hand, or put it in the chat. I wanted to I guess finally, my closing reflection while we wait for questions to come in was that right before we began working with the Mexican automotive parts industry, our prior foray just before that had been into energy efficiency in factories writ large, any type of factory. And one thing that really resonated with me was in line with what Armando was saying about the narrative and what you can say about your job. And I don't know about anyone else here on this call, but all of us on this call, I think, work in international development. And some of us have advanced degrees and earn about a quarter or a third of what our peers with advanced degrees do, because we have this wonderful narrative that we tell ourselves about our jobs. And it's a massive benefit. I go to bed every night thinking that I'm helping to change the world for the better. I'm helping people. And when we started interviewing young engineering students in Ciudad Juarez that had helped us pilot our energy efficiency curriculum, we were very surprised to hear a very similar narrative come out of their mouths. One young man said, you know, my grandparents moved here to Ciudad Juarez because they couldn't make it as farmers anymore. And they started working on the production line, making auto parts. And my parents became technicians. And I'm the first one who gets to be an engineer in my family. And I knew that in order to keep on building along this trajectory, I would work in a factory. And I'd work in a factory for the benefit of my city and the benefit of my family. But today, with being able to apply these green skills at work, I now feel like I'm saving the world. And I never thought I'd get to do that. And I feel like that's something that provides benefits that we tend to overlook when we are thinking of low income participants. But the benefit that our participants expressed to us in feeling that they were contributing beyond the economic development of their city, the social mobility of their family, but also in order to combat climate change, was hard to quantify, but very qualitatively important. And when it's tied to a higher earning job as well, it's something that I'm not sure how we measure it. And I'd love to get our MERL experts on the call's opinion. But it's something that I think we need to consider as we think about what these green jobs can and do mean to young people. So in this context, I'm going to take the largest definition of youth, which I think goes from 15 to 35 is my personal definition, is the question from Maureen Roman. Would like to know, what is the definition of youth in this context? So that was the sort of framing that I had for this conversation, was 15 to 35, the largest definition of youth. With that, we're 2 minutes from closing. Does anyone have any further questions or any further remarks, Armando and Casey, to close? No? Excellent.
No.
Well, please go ahead, Armando.
No. I only wanted to thank you for this effort. And I think we need to talk more about these green skills and these in a holistic way. So that would be to think about community, to think about the power of narrative. I think, as you mentioned right now, the power of narrative can change the world and can change our lives and our communities. And I think this energy transition is a perfect example of the power of the narrative, and we can do concrete things for this transition to happen.
Thank you so much, Armando. That's really inspiring. I want to thank Armando and Casey for giving us their time, their expertise, and their perspective. I feel like in our industry, oftentimes we end up speaking with government, with other international development professionals, and it's wonderful to hear from industry about their perspectives and insights in what this energy transmission means, particularly as we try and think about how can we train young people for these opportunities. So thank you for your time and for answering our questions so completely and comprehensively. And then thank you to our participants for your thoughtful questions, your reflections and insights. And finally, thank you to Gabby and Jackie from Tetra Tech for providing all of your incredible cat herding services and logistical support. Thank you very much. And with that, I think we will close. Goodbye. Thank you.